Oh, it worked. Well, that was annoying. Can you hear and see me now? All right, awesome. I really need to find a different place to sit because the background light is bad here. All right, cool. All right, I'm going to pull up the discussion board and we'll go through a few of the things here. Um, or would it be better if I just kind of went through the major trade routes and then went through the discussion board? I also have an idea that I want to pitch to you guys. Maybe we'll start there. So I'm thinking I want to create a Google document that everyone can edit and basically create like a giant review sheet for every unit. We'll start with just with this unit specifically. So it'd almost be like a spice chart style. Um, I might get into um, Google Sheets tonight and mess around. I think that a spreadsheet might be the easiest way to do it. Maybe not. I don't know. I have to look around. Um, yeah, so that's the idea is that anyone can insert information and then I can go back through and like if there's something wrong, I can fix it. But I want it to be open for everyone to edit because um, I think that we can get more information in that way. Maybe um, I'll mess around tonight with it and see what I can come up with. If you guys think that's a pretty good idea, I think it might work decently well. I've tried to do these before, and the reality is that doing it by myself ends up being just hours and hours and hours of work because it's so much stuff. But if everyone's kind of putting in like some stuff and then more in an editing mode, then I think that that would be a good idea. Um, all right. So let's run through some trade routes real quick. And so the main thing that you need to know about each trade route is the location. You can write this down if you want. The main things that you want to know about each trade route is the location of the trade route, the empires involved in trade on that trade route. You want to know what technologies are being used to make trade happen on that trade route, what economic innovations are at play, what products are being traded on that trade route, and then finally, what ideas and religions are being spread on that trade route. And an additional thing that I would point out is you need to know the things that make these trade routes important. What I mean, let me rephrase. Like at what time period are these trade routes at their height and why? So that's kind of an addendum to everything. So let's kind of run through those. I'll let you guys pick. Whoever says the trade route, their favorite trade route first is what I'll go with. I know you have a favorite trade route. I'm waiting on you guys. Trans-Saharan. All right, I knew I could count on you. All right, so the Trans-Saharan trade route. Let's go over it. I probably should have written down all the things I just said, so I go in the same order for each one of these. So the first thing I said is where is it? Well, the Trans-Saharan trade route is going to take place predominantly in North Africa, not North America. And the two regions that it really connects are West Africa with Europe and Northern Africa. And the thing that's really important to understand is that northern Africa, at the height of the trans-Saharan trade route, is really an extension of the Arab world, as is southern Europe. I mean, if you think about Spain. And so you could think of the trans-Saharan trade route as connecting the Arab world with the West African world, instead of really the European world. Even though the so Europeans are going to gain access to goods from West Africa by way of the Arab traders. So you can kind of think of the network as going from West Africa across the Sahara Desert to North Africa, and then from North Africa across the Mediterranean Sea to Europeans. And really, I actually used to teach the Mediterranean trade route as a separate trade route altogether, but you can kind of think of the Mediterranean as an extension of the Trans-Saharan trade route and as an extension of the Silk Roads into Europe. So that's the area that connects Europe with the rest of these areas, and the Italian merchants are the key people in doing that. So you have kind of like your really big trade routes, and really Europe is kind of on the periphery of these larger trade networks. But Europe does have some trade, and the Mediterranean Sea is the most important. Another thing, and I don't even know if this is in your book or not, but if you're talking about Europe during this time period, I guess we should mention a little bit about Europe. Is there's a trade route in the northern part of Europe called the Hanseatic Trade Network, or the Hanseatic League. And this was sort of like the old Viking trade routes that are being connected by sort of more modern sailing techniques and stuff. Basically, they're like the ancestors of the Vikings. And so there's a lot of big European cities like Copenhagen in Denmark, London in England, um, places like Cologne in Germany. These are part of that trade network. And if you're looking for any type of trade network in Europe during this time period, this is sort of the forerunner to any type of trade actually happening in Northern Europe. So Northern Europe was not an area with a lot of trade, but this is one example of that. All right, so back to the Trans-Saharan trade route, which is a much larger and more important trade network than what we just talked about. So it's connecting Northern Africa to Western Africa is kind of where you can kind of think of this. And this is one network that's connected to other networks of trade as well. So, you also have the sub-Saharan trade routes, and I don't want to get too confusing, but basically the people that were bringing stuff from the interior of Africa up to the big trade cities in the north, that would have been considered a sub-Saharan trade route. And I'll mention that when I get to the Indian Ocean trade as well. But there were people trading in the interior of West Africa, as well as on the periphery. And so when we talk about the big trade networks for Africa, we're really talking about the periphery, on the border of the desert and then on the border of the coast. But there's people on the inside that are bringing goods to those outside regions. And so you can kind of think of the trade of this time period as just like it's not people aren't trading the whole distance of these trade networks in most cases. One of the things that makes the Trans-Saharan Trade Network a little bit unique is the fact that you actually do have one group of people that is sort of facilitating trade through the desert itself, and that's because they were specialists. Okay, and that group of people were called the Tuareg. The Tuareg were the people that actually made the journey across the desert, and they were specialists at traveling across the desert. The Sahara Desert is the largest desert in the world, unless you're talking about Antarctica. And it is extremely difficult to navigate. You can kind of think of it as an ocean of sand. And it requires specialized equipment, specialized knowledge. And the people that did this were experts at doing this. And so the technologies that they used were pretty important as well. So some of the technologies they relied on, one is just animals, camels in particular. You cannot do the Trans-Saharan Trade Network without camels and without camel husbandry, camel breeding. We talked a little bit about the super camels, which was if you breed a one-humped camel with a two-humped camel, you get a superior camel for desert crossing. So that's one example of that. You also have the camel saddle, which makes it possible for you to put a bunch of stuff on a camel's back and move anywhere, because camels have those humps, which are really important for their ability to survive in the desert, but they are not great for putting stuff on. So the camel saddle is a pretty key invention that sort of facilitates the trans-Saharan trade as well. In addition to this, you have some navigational equipment. Things like the astrolabe did become used on the trans-Saharan trade route. The astrolabe was designed by Arab people so that they could travel across the desert in Saudi Arabia, and then some of that technology did transfer into the trans-Saharan network. What you can really think of is, if you're trying to move across the desert, it makes sense to move at night in a lot of cases, because you don't have to face the same extreme temperatures that you do during the daytime. And so you need something that you can navigate by the night stars with, and that's what the astrolabe does. You're able to navigate based off your astral positioning. You basically use this to measure the distances between stars. And that's how an astrolabe works. So those are some of the technologies. The big two, camels and camel saddles, are kind of the key things here. And the key goods that are being traded on the trans-Saharan trade route is gold from West Africa. This was the good that pretty much everyone wanted. And then salt, which was actually mined by the Tuareg in the Sahara. And so basically, you can kind of think of it this way. The Tuareg were merchants. They would mine the salt, take it down to Africa, trade that for gold, then bring the gold up to Northern Africa and Europe and trade that for manufactured goods that they would then sometimes use, or sometimes they would take those manufactured goods back across. Sometimes they would trade for other things. But gold is the kind of key thing, and salt is the kind of key thing. And salt's so important because you use it to preserve food. And sometimes salt moved the opposite direction on this trade route as well. It didn't always just move to Africa. Sometimes it moved north to Europe, where it was used for salting fish and preserving food as well. The salt fish industry was growing very rapidly during this time period because of a need for ships to be able to travel overseas, and you need a food supply that will last. And salt fish in particular is a really key way for you to make that happen. So yeah, salt was a big deal. It's worth a lot. And gold, of course, is a key product from Africa. Now, there were other goods as well. We do see ivory being traded from Africa up north, and we see some early examples of slavery. Especially, there were some slaves traded from West Africa into the Arab world. That was relatively common. The Arab world had a decent amount of slavery in it. They did not pick their slaves based off of race, like we're going to see later when we get to European slavery. But there were a pretty significant number of African slaves in the Arab world. But you would have also found European slaves. You would have also found Asian slaves. And people from different areas would have been slaves in the Arab world. So it wasn't just Africans, but this is a precursor to what we're going to see later on, if that makes sense. Okay. What else did I say I was going to cover with each trade route? Religion. Okay, the primary religion that's moving with the trans-Saharan trade route is going to be Islam. Islam moves from Northern Africa, which is an Arab area, into sub-Saharan Africa. And the pattern of conversion is really interesting. The first people to convert are merchants, which makes sense because they're able to use Sharia law to protect their trade. This is beneficial. They also make sense for them to convert to Islam because it makes dealings and relationships with merchants in Northern Africa easier. And then the other group that converts to Islam is the elites, the kings and the nobles of, or I guess you could, the important people of West Africa. And the reason the elites convert is because monotheism provides several advantages when it comes to consolidating power. You have one God that you can claim your power from instead of multiple gods, which increases your power because that one God is going to be more powerful than multiple gods. The best example of this is with in the Ghana Empire. We see people converting to it later on, but then Mali. When Mali is established, all the kings in Mali are Islamic. That said, the conversion pattern kind of ends with the elites. You don't see the common people really convert to Islam other than a syncretic form of Islam that we talked about last week, which is more based around some of the um, superstitions of animism combined with some of the traditions of Islam. So, for instance, I think I mentioned carrying the Quran in your pocket to ward off evil spirits. That's an example of that kind of syncretism that we see. So, the conversion pattern is basically think of the wealthy and the merchants converting, and then the common people not converting. Another thing that was interesting, another syncretic facet, is the role that women play in African society. So while Islam becomes important in Africa, what we don't see is some of the restrictions on women, like harems and veiling. That never makes its way to West Africa. Instead, in West Africa, we see that women maintain most of the rights they had before because they had traditionally had more rights in African society, and so that sort of was a continuation of that, and it caused a bit of a change. When Ibn Battuta actually traveled to West Africa, he was surprised by the way that the women interacted with the men, how they interacted without any sort of bashfulness. They were very upfront, and that weirded him out a little bit. He was used to living in a more conservative Islamic society than what was seen in West Africa. Okay, did I cover all the things I said I was going to cover with each trade route for the Trans-Saharan? And does anyone have any questions on the Trans-Saharan trade route? I'll give another 30 seconds for people to type. Yeah, Sharia law. Great question. So Sharia law is the traditional Islamic law code. It's what's laid out in the Quran, and it has all kinds of laws about everything. But one of the things that we want to remember in regards to trade is that Muhammad was a merchant, and the Arab society that he lived in was a very merchant-based society. And so the law code, Sharia law, is very favorable to merchants. It's not like, in some societies, the idea of being a merchant was considered terrible. So, for instance, like in China, merchants were considered to be tricky and untrustworthy and bad people. And so the law codes oftentimes stifled merchants to a certain degree. But with Islam, because the religion itself is sort of created by merchants, you see this favoritism almost shown towards trade. Well, not maybe favoritism, but like there's all sorts of things in the law code that make it good to make money. For instance, you don't. So for I'll give you one example, like tithing. Okay, so in Christianity, you have a concept called tithing. Tithing means that you give a certain percentage of your money to charity. In Islam, you have alms. Alms means you give a specific portion of your money to charity. Now, both of these are important for those religions because they promote the idea of giving. However, tithing is traditionally 10% in Christianity. Almsgiving is 2.5%. So, if you're a merchant in Islam versus a merchant in Christianity, you get to keep more money if you're in Islam. Does that make sense? If you're like following the rules. So that encourages people to convert to Islam as opposed to Christianity. That might encourage that. But there's a lot of other things as well. So, for instance, one of the things that Islam does is it establishes these local scholars. These you could almost think of them as judges, called qadis, and they're going to be around the Islamic world. And these people make judgments based off Sharia law. So if, for instance, I felt like I got cheated in a deal, in a trade deal, then I could go to the local Qadi and sue for justice to be done in that situation. So your property is protected in that way. And it just creates stability, and it creates protection of property. And if you're creating stability and protection of property, then you're going to see increases in trade. Does that answer your question? All right. I am going to talk about the Indian Ocean trade next, I suppose. So let's do that in 1 second. I got to see what my son wants. I'll be right back. What? Graham. Okay. All right. Indian Ocean trade. So where is it? It's in the Indian Ocean. Who does it involve? It involves a lot of people. Indian Ocean trade is going to involve more people than just about any other trade network. So more people groups. So who's involved? China is involved. India is involved. Arabia is involved. Southeast Asia, particularly the kingdoms of Indonesia, are involved. And then the east coast of Africa, or the Swahili city-states, are involved. Most continents in the old world are involved, with the exception of Europe, okay, and I guess Australia. So this is, well, I guess it's really just Asia and Africa, but Asia's huge, so lots of different people groups there. Hold on 1 second. Brianna, can you please help him? So that's the I don't know what he needs. Okay, so those are the people groups that are involved in trade right there. And as you trade in the Indian Ocean, obviously it's a maritime trade route. So the trade is going to be all on ocean. So our technologies are going to be ship technologies. Major barrier to trade. So in the case of the trans-Saharan trade, you have a huge barrier in the desert itself. The barrier in this case is the ocean. But the thing is that there are parts of this trade route that are beneficial to merchants, and those are monsoon winds. So in the Indian Ocean, you have winds that will blow one direction part of the year, and then they'll blow the other direction the other part of the year. That's really helpful if you know when those winds are going to occur, because you can take your ship and go, woo, and you can land here, and then you can go back, and you can land there. And so the monsoons are sort of how people travel. Those are the roads that people travel on the Indian Ocean trade, and they need ships to do it. The ship that is going to become the most common is an Arab ship called the dhow. That's spelled this way. And dhows are small ships that are used for they're easily maneuverable. They carry a significant amount of cargo. They have a small crew, which is cheap, and they rely on a lateen sail, which is an invention that originally came from Southeast Asia and then moved to India and then moved to the Arab world. And that sail allows you to tack against the wind so that you can be even more maneuverable than before. And so these are the technologies that really allow for sailing across the Indian Ocean. In addition to this, you're also going to have the astrolabe, which I mentioned before, and you will also have the compass, which is going to come from China and be put to use there. You also have the invention of the rudder. which was a Chinese invention that allows for easier steering of ships. And so all of this, lots of technologies here, lots of sailing technologies that are useful in the Indian Ocean trade. As far as the goods that are being traded, this is again one of the most diverse uh, array of items being traded. But I think that when I think of the Indian Ocean trade, the primary thing I think of is spices. So, I mean, if you think about it, India, if the Indian Ocean trade is this circular area, then you've got this one area that's hanging down here in India itself, and India is kind of the center of the spice network. So, yeah, spices, pepper, nutmeg, cinnamon, cardamom, the list goes on. Or turmeric, all of these different spices um, are being traded. Another key thing that's being traded is cotton. So cotton is not valuable enough to trade on a land trade route usually because it's not the most valuable cloth. But when you're talking about a sea trade route, you can put more bulk items because you have big ships. And so cotton is a key item of trade on the Indian Ocean trade route. You also have lumber, you have grain, you have some valuable luxury commodities like gems, silk, perfume. Perfume's a big one from the Arab world. A lot of perfume came from Arabia, like things like frankincense and myrrh. Okay, those were some of the perfumes that were being traded from these areas. So really, a lot of things being traded on the Indian Ocean trade. I would keep spices in the front of my head if I've got a question on that, and then I would also think about the fact that you can transport bulk items because you have ships and you're not putting everything on camels. Does that make sense? So something like grain is going to be traded on the Indian Ocean trade, but you're not going to trade grain on the Trans-Saharan trade. All right. And then because you're at the ocean, you need provisions for sea voyages. So preservable goods are going to be important for feeding your sailors and things like that. Another thing to keep in mind about the Indian Ocean trade is that it might be the best example of a trade route that is responsible for the spreading of different religions and cultures. And that's because of the nature of the monsoons. Because when you traveled from one part of the world to another and then you stayed there for a long period of time while you waited for the monsoons to change, you don't want to change your entire life. So, Muslim merchants that would travel from, say, Arabia to Indonesia would build mosques in Indonesia because they were there for 6 months out of the year. And they would continue to live as Muslims those 6 months of the year. And then they would sail back and, live as Muslims in Arabia. Or whatever. Or, you had Africans living in India for 6 months out of the year. And these communities created a lot of diversity in these areas and allowed for the transition of a lot of different religions. So, you see Buddhism spreading out of India and into Southeast Asia. You see Islam spreading into Indonesia. You see Islam spreading into parts of India. You see Islam spreading into East Africa. Places on the coast of East Africa, even today, are largely Islamic. Thank you. And that's all because of this trade network. So, lots of important things there. One thing that is kind of interesting, I don't know if I talked about this earlier this year, but in Indonesia in particular, or in Southeast Asia in particular, there was actually a custom at play where in order for you to trade in Southeast Asia, the women actually conducted trade, or they were sort of like the keys to trading, because the idea in that part of the world was that you couldn't trade with people that weren't part of your family. And so if you were an Arab merchant, for instance, that came to Southeast Asia to do business, then you would actually have to, in Singapore, absolutely. You'd actually have to marry into one of the families there. And, it was like a business arrangement, but it did give women some power in that area. because they were kind of like the keys to doing business. But it also opened the door for even more syncretism because in some cases you might have, a wife in Singapore for half the year that, and then you would have your wife or wives in Arabia for half the year or something like that. So that obviously opens the door for even more intercultural connections, even on a family level. And you would obviously see blends of cultures and traditions because of this. And this is one of the reasons why places like Indonesia have a predominantly Islamic population today. Let's see. What else did I say I was going to talk about on this? Did I miss any of my categories? As far as the empires are concerned, I kind of forgot about talking about empires. The empires in Africa for the trans-Saharan trade are predominantly Ghana and Mali, and then later on Songhai, but that really kind of leads into the next time period. Those are the big West African empires. With the Indian Ocean trade, you have a lot of different areas. You've got the Abbasid Caliphate, obviously, for the Arab world. But then on the east coast of Africa, you have these Swahili city-states. And actually, I made a mistake on your last periodization quiz. I said that it was question number 20. And thank you, Alyssa, for pointing this out to me. But on question number 20, I accidentally had Swahili city-states rise up on the east coast of Africa as being dated from 1450 to 1750. That is not correct. It should be 1200 to 1450. Okay? So just make sure you recognize that. That's how I taught it, but for whatever reason, when I was making a little quiz, I messed it up. So so the Swahili city-states rise up, and Swahili itself is a syncretic language, right? It's a blend of Bantu African languages with Arabic. So they're in power, and then you have trading kingdoms in Indonesia and Southeast Asia. You have places, you have pre-Islamic kingdoms like Majapahit, which was a Hindu Buddhist kingdom, and Srivijaya, which was another Buddhist kingdom. And then after Islam comes in, you have places like the Sultanate of Malacca, which is an Islamic trading kingdom in Southeast Asia. And then, of course, you have China and whatever dynasty happens to be in charge of China at the given time period that you're studying. So, if you're talking about the Indian Ocean trade in 1200, then you're going to be dealing with the Song dynasty. Okay. The most important Chinese dynasty when it comes to the Indian Ocean trade is going to be the Ming dynasty. And can anyone tell me why the Ming dynasty is the most important Chinese dynasty for trade in the Indian Ocean? There's one person that's very important. I will write his name. The one person that you would need to know is Zheng He. Zheng He is the Chinese explorer that takes his treasure ships into the Indian Ocean and sort of spreads the idea of Chinese superiority throughout that area, and brings back all sorts of ideas. I mean, he's the guy who brings back giraffes from Africa to China to put in the zoos there, all kinds of stuff. But he's a pretty important figure when you talk about the spread of Chinese influence around the Indian Ocean, right before China goes full isolationist mode. So Ming Dynasty is originally kind of outward looking, and then they go isolationist. Okay. Okay, Silk Road time. Any questions about this before I move on to the Silk Road? Okay. Give you 2 more seconds to ask questions. All right, Silk Road then. So, key thing with Silk Road, think about this is Eurasia. Silk Road connects China with Europe. And it's not just one road, but lots of different roads. Some people even consider the Indian Ocean trade routes to be a part of a greater Silk Roads. It doesn't matter in my mind. I like to break them up personally, but The thing is that how a good got from one area to another could have used both trade routes. It didn't have to just stick to one. Like you could have been on the Silk Road from China to, you could have gone on the Silk Road from China to say um, Susa in Persia, and then from there it could get on a ship and sail around to Alexandria in Egypt. And technically, you would have been on two trade routes. So, yeah, I mean, it's not one continuity. Like no one's traveling the whole distance of the Silk Road by themselves. Instead, it's moving from place to place. So you move from here to here, and then trade your goods to that person, and then they trade it to that person, and they trade it to that person, and so on. So it's a series of stops. Um, just a fun side note. If you're interested in like looking at like the modern places where the Silk Road passed through, the country of Uzbekistan was at the center of the Silk Road, and they just lifted all of their visa stuff a few years back, or earlier this year, and so like they're trying to promote themselves as a tourist destination now. Looks really cool. I want to go there. Anyway, all right. So Silk Road. Who's involved? The primary groups involved depend on the time period that you're talking about. In the early parts of the Silk Road, you have Rome and the Han Dynasty, but that's really before our time period. So during the time period that we covered in class, all you really need to know is that the Silk Road's trade had always been facilitated by nomadic groups. And from 1200 to 1450, the group that facilitates trade is the Mongols. So we're talking about the Mongols piecing together the Silk Road and actually making it stronger than it ever had been before. So you have the different groups at the ends. The Mongols are the ones that are kind of making it flow. They're the ones that are actually doing a lot of the trading. And there's more unity in the Silk Road during our particular time period than just about any other time period in history, just because of the Mongols themselves. The Silk Road is at its height during the Mongol Empire. And some people refer to that as the Mongol Peace or the Pax Mongolica. So what's being traded? Silk, obviously, but then everything else, every other luxury item that you could kind of think of, anything that you can put on the back of a horse or a camel and travel with. The other thing to keep in mind about the Silk Road is that technologically wise, environmentally, you have a lot of different environments across Eurasia, but the predominant environment is steppe. And steppe is basically large grassland. And so horses are going to be the thing that you see a lot of. In addition to that, you have some deserts, especially the Taklamakan Desert, which is the large desert that sort of separates Central Asia from China. And so camels were important for that stage as well. And you would really have specialists. Like you wouldn't be a merchant that traded from, maybe you were the merchant that traded across the desert, and maybe you were a merchant that traded across a specific part of the steppe. You probably wouldn't do both. Does that make sense? There weren't many people that traveled the full length of the Silk Road, but if you were looking for one person that did, Marco Polo is an example of someone who actually traveled the entire length of the Silk Road. Ibn Battuta traveled segments of the Silk Road, and those are guys that we've talked a bit about. And then another thing to keep in mind is that another technology, another thing that facilitated trade in this area were caravanserais, which I kind of think of as camel hotels. I'm going to write that on the thing that caravanserai. Think of it as a camel hotel. It's where you and your camels can stop for the evening. And these were prominent places for trade and traders because they could stop and regroup, get water, things like that they needed, and also get a nice meal. So, if you think about it, if you're a merchant and you're traveling across this area, these would be important places to stop. You kind of think of them as exits on the interstate. At each exit, you've got like a gas station, a fast food restaurant, and a hotel. And that's what I think of when I think of the caravanserai. It's like an ancient version of an interstate exit. And these were about a day's journey apart in most cases. That way, you would always have places to stay. And a lot of times, these caravanserai were facilitated by a lot of times Buddhist monks in some cases, especially in East Asia, and that facilitated the spread of Buddhism. So those Buddhist monasteries would sometimes live on these trade routes. Of course, by the time we get to the rise of the Mongols, Islam is going to have superseded Buddhism in a lot of respects, but the two major religions being spread along the Silk Road are really Buddhism and Islam. Islam takes over and becomes more important than Buddhism by the time we get to you know 1200, 1300. So Central Asia really has a rich Buddhist history that converts to being a Islamic history in a lot of cases. But you also have, I mean, you have all these different trade groups that come in, and so like you even have Jewish people living in these areas. A lot of diasporic communities um, along the Silk Road and the Indian Ocean trade routes. Just a reminder, a diasporic community is when you have one group of people that moves into another area and then stay there, and they're separated from their original homeland. Um, let's see, any other major things about the Silk Road? Christianity's also spread on the Silk Road as well, especially a form of Christianity called Nestorian Christianity, which was a form of Christianity that was actually like banned in the Western world, um, but it became the most popular Silk Road Christianity. One of Genghis Khan's wives was actually a Nestorian Christian. Um, all right, I'm going to talk about the rise and fall of all of these trade routes in a second, but does anyone have any specific questions about the Silk Road? All right, so during this time period, all of these trade routes are kind of at their height. So from 1200 to 1450 is really a high point for most of these trade routes. You have the Mali Empire in Africa really promoting the trans-Saharan trade routes. And then you have in the Indian Ocean trade route, you have the Swahili city states. And then you have there's different kingdoms in India, like the Delhi Sultanate and the Chola kingdoms. And then you have several different kingdoms in Southeast Asia that are all supporting the Indian Ocean trade. And then the Mongols in the Silk Road. By the end of this time period, by 1400 to 1450, that era, we're starting to see the decline of some of these trade routes. The Mongols begin to decline by about 1400, which is going to shake up the Silk Road a little bit. Okay. But the number one thing that really changes all of this is the fall of Constantinople, because the fall of Constantinople in 1453 is going to cause Europeans to sail around Africa. And that's when all of this changes. So 1450 is a critical turning point in world history, and it's the reason it's our turning point here because that's when Europeans start to leave Europe and go to these other areas to find the goods that they had been getting by proxy. So, they had been getting gold from Africa by proxy of, the Arabs and the Tuareg people. They had been getting silk from China by proxy of Mongol merchants and by, Persian and Arab merchants. And they had been getting spices from India through, these different merchants as well. And now they're looking for direct access to those sources. And when they do that, they disrupt all of these trade routes because they're looking maritimely. I don't know. They're on the water. And so they circumvent the trans-Saharan trade and go directly to West Africa. And then they circumvent the Silk Road by going directly to Asia. They take over control of the trade route in the Indian Ocean, and they're no longer using the Silk Road. So it causes all of these trade routes to decline. Well, it causes the Silk Road and the Trans-Saharan, the two land-based trade routes, to decline, and then it changes the balance of power in the Indian Ocean trade route. Indian Ocean trade actually increases, but it increases in the favor of Europeans and not in the favor of other people. Okay, any questions in that regard? Let me pull up some of the review questions and see if I see anything. Michael, I liked your comment about the Indian Ocean trade being maybe the most important. I mean, obviously that's a question that can be easily debated, but I like your argument. That was an interesting one. So 1200 to 1450, what effect did trade routes have on the spread of religion? Early on, it's Buddhism, but then Islam. Here's a good question. Did Genghis Khan have a reason for conquering territories? That's a good question. What was his reasoning for doing it? It seems to me that he initially began by trying to sort of consolidate the Mongol tribes, the Mongol clans. And in the process of doing that, he created sort of this machine that he could then use to conquer other territories. And once he realized he could do it, why not do it? I would say that the primary reason he did what he was doing was for plunder. He was looking for riches. So it wasn't. So yeah, I mean, there's arguments there was a need for resources. By 1200, there were shortages in some of the areas that the Mongols had been in. The grass wasn't growing as well as it had been. And so some of that forced the nomadic people out of their traditional areas. So yeah, you can make an environmental argument as well. But I think to a certain degree, Genghis Khan wanted to. He develops a sense for his own power and greatness, and he wanted to expand on that. Like, if you can conquer the world, why not? And there's another. Delaney says, was it from rivalry? Genghis Khan's expansion. Part of it actually was. I mean, part of the reason he ended up conquering a large part of Central Asia was because there was another Khan there that had basically promised to help him fight against China and then bailed at the last minute. And so after Genghis Khan defeated China, he wanted to get revenge on that guy that didn't do it. And so he went after him until he conquered him. And in the process of trying to capture this other Khan, he kind of conquered most of Central Asia. So yeah, a lot of, I mean, some of it was personal. Like, he sent a message to the Khwarezmian Shahdan, which was the big Persian Empire at the time, and the Shah had his messengers killed, and so then he basically went in and destroyed them because he felt insulted. So Genghis Khan's an interesting figure. She also asked, on a different note, why did Zheng He's voyages raise controversy despite its purpose to display the Ming Dynasty's power and expand the trade markets? That's an easier question to answer. The primary reason Zheng He got shut down was because there was a disagreement in China, especially amongst the elites and the ruling class, as to what China should be doing with its money. The emperor that sent him out on these voyages was a big supporter of Chinese expansion, but that's kind of opposite of traditional Chinese values. China has not had that many periods of expansion in its history. The Tang Dynasty is the most notable example of that. But for the most time, China's like, this is the borders of the Chinese people, and this is where we're going to stay. You don't usually see, like, the Chinese Empire is not like the Roman Empire, right? Rome's constantly trying to expand. They're trying to get bigger and trying to conquer other people groups. China has its size, and they kind of just stay there. That's why we usually refer to it as a dynasty as opposed to an empire, or at least part of the reason, because the idea of empire usually implies sort of this constant expansion. So the traditional idea in China is that like we need to stick to ourselves. China's already the best. We don't need to expand to other areas to show people how great we are. They already come to us and know how great we are. And then the other part of that, the other part of the reason why his voyages were eventually canceled was the emperor that was sponsoring them died, and there had been several attacks from people from the north, which brought back memories of the Mongols, and so there was an active effort to take resources that were being spoken of these voyages and focus on defense against the northern of the northern border, because there was a fear that people from the north would conquer China again, which was pretty correct. I mean, in 1644, the Manchu were one of these groups, and they come in and conquer them. So, here's a good question from Christina. How did the bubonic plague affect the cities and possibly the trade routes? So I haven't talked about plague yet. Plague is an example of something that is accidentally spread along trade routes like the Silk Road, and has massive impacts on the people as it goes in terms of death. And so you basically have this pandemic that's unleashed by global connectivity, and that's kind of the idea here, which, kind of, if you think about, like, I mean, this is a really good modern comparison. If you think about something like COVID-19, diseases like this broke out all the time in the ancient world, and a few people got sick, maybe a lot of people got sick in the village, and then people died, and then it was over. And the reason that it stayed in that particular area is because the transportation and communication was so poor that people didn't see other people. They basically were social distancing all the time. My phone's ringing. Sorry about that. They were social distancing all the time because that's how you lived at the time. You just social distance because your transportation sucked. Well, you can kind of see the Black Death, and Black Death was something, it wasn't new. It wasn't like Black Death struck for the first time during this time period. What's unique about the Black Death, what makes bubonic plague become the Black Death, is global connectivity. So this is a fantastic example of that. The Silk Road allows for it to spread more, just like modern day airplanes and travel made COVID-19 spread more. And so this is an example of early globalization, and that's sort of the unique thing about the Silk Road and the Black Death. It's an early example of this exact concept that we're seeing right now. And the more connected we are as a group of people, the more we risk things like global pandemic, because it's harder to slow down and harder to stop because people move much more than they used to. I'll answer one more question from the review board, and then I'll answer any questions in the chat. All right, Brian, I'll read your question. We know the Silk Road was a bunch of routes for the spread of stuff, but what determined where these routes were and how it was optimized? And finally, who funded scholars like Ibn Battuta to roam around, and where can I find these people? That's the most important question of all. All right, for starters, these trade routes were determined by where the cities were. And so you have your big cities that were already established, and then the goods would be traveling from this area to this area. And then you had a city down here that would take goods from this area to, say, this area. Well, in the middle, those trade routes cross. Does that make sense? And the more these trade routes crisscross, so you have your big cities that are kind of like the ends of the trade routes. That determines where the trade routes go. And then where the trade routes cross, you get more cities. Does that make sense? And then in some cases, those cities become destinations of their own right. A really good example of cities on the ends of trade routes, places like Rome Places like Shanghai in China or Guangzhou in China, those are sort of like the end places. But then you have those cities in the middle, places like Kashgar, or places like Samarkand. Samarkand is a really good example of a. I'm going to take it in. Samarkand is a really good example of a trade route city. It is totally determined by the fact that that's where the trade routes crossed. Okay, there's only so where the cities are and then where the geography is. That's what determines where trade routes are, because you're going to take your trade route through the area of least resistance. So you're going to go around the desert if at all possible. You're going to go through the mountain pass. You're not going to climb over the Himalayas. Does that make sense? So geography and then the positioning of cities determines. And if you have a geographic map and a bunch of ancient cities, you could probably predict where the trade routes would go just based off of those factors. And then you ask who funded scholars like Ibn Battuta to roam around. That's a great question. From what I can tell, Marco Polo was pretty much funded by his dad was a merchant and he was a merchant, and so like they were. I don't know. I mean, from what I can tell, I mean he ended up being a prisoner of Kublai Khan and kind of. I mean, it wasn't like he was traveling in luxury, really. With Ibn Battuta, he kind of was traveling in luxury, and I think he was funded by. I think he worked for a university and was funded for them by them, but don't quote me on that. So, how do you do this? How can you become a person like Ibn Battuta and roam around? I would suggest um, finding a job that travels a lot and relies on, you educating people about all those things. I actually have some ideas in mind. We can talk later if you want. And don't get married, because if you're married, then it makes it difficult for you to travel around a lot. So, yeah. I'm sure Ibn Battuta wasn't married. Or actually, he probably was. It was a patriarchy, so he didn't have to, do stuff. All right, does anybody have any other questions for today? Are we covering anything past World War II? Yes, we will. You heard the AP test was open note. I have not heard that, but it would not shock me if they made it open note, because how the heck would they control it, right? Like, there's absolutely no way they can know if you're looking at your notes. So that wouldn't shock me. I'll know more on Friday. That's when they're going to tell us what it's supposed to look like. Are we covering anything past World War II in the future? Yeah, I plan on it when we're done with the AP exam, but everything's kind of up in the air still. Any other questions? One last thing about the AP test is that I do know that there's going to be some plan to run every single student's written answers through a checker of some sort. I don't know if they're developing it or they're planning on using something that's already made, but they will be able to tell. They will be able to tell if, like, you sent your buddy your answer and then y'all wrote the same thing. Can we watch movies after the exam and say they relate to history? Dude, there are movies that relate to history. We don't have to say that they're related to history. I'll give you a list. All right. Well, I will see you on Thursday. This is the plan for now. And I will look into doing the Google Drive thing either tonight, or tomorrow. I'm trying to keep assignments to a minimum as far as writing stuff, because I hear that you guys are kind of covered up with written assignments. So I'm going to kind of keep doing the discussion boards and the short quizzes for now. There will be one short answer question probably at the end of this week or the beginning of next week. All right, I am signing off. Have a great evening.